Listening to Rick, you can see the kind of thought that went into forming the philosophy of the National Museum of the American Indian. And I have had two thoughts while Rick was describing that in such eloquent detail. The first was that I'm really glad he and Suzan did all that thinking, because I don't know that I could have done it. But the second is to say that those ideas are so deeply embedded in the NMAI, they're second nature. We don't think of them as revolutionary or even particularly remarkable. It's simply who we are, and it's how we do things. And increasingly, it's become how all museums certainly in the U.S., but even elsewhere in the world, are beginning to do their business when they're working with indigenous material. And that is a tribute to the founders of the National Museum of the American Indian. I also want to be sure and mention again, I know it's already been said, but this symposium is in truth the brainchild of Patsy Phillips and Bob Martin at the Institute of American Indian Art in the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts. At Indian Market in 2018, Patsy came and asked if the National Museum of the American Indian would be willing to co-sponsor a symposium at the IAIA in Santa Fe. And basically I begged her and said, can we do it at the NMAI and you guys be the co-sponsors with us there? But it gives you a sense of how we both want to lay claim to the legacy of Suzan Harjo. So in addition to her many skills, Suzan also found herself in the position of being a curator, a guest curator, of an extremely important exhibition here at the National Museum of the American Indian. And that was our Nation to Nation exhibition, Nation to Nation American Treaties between the United States and American Indian nations. We call it Treaties for shorthand. One of the things I learned is that exhibitions get nicknames over time. And so this one became Treaties. The beautiful A Song for the Horse Nation became Horses. A lovely exhibition called Identity by Design became Dresses. And so that's sort of what we do. It's sort of museum speak for these things. But Suzan had already been engaged by Rick as to be a guest curator for an exhibition on treaties. And it was underway when I arrived. Now, this was a challenging subject for this museum, and I think for any museum, because of the subject matter. You can't just put the text of a treaty on the wall and expect anyone to pay much attention to it, or at least not for very long. In the end, the subject matter is over 380 separate historical documents, and how do you go about choosing them? In order to convey any real understanding of the meaning of these treaties, you have to delve into some very complex legislative matters and court decisions. And then this museum was handicapped by a rookie director who really didn't know much about creating an exhibition. I've learned a lot since then. One of the things I learned is that exhibitions become almost like people, because they start out as these cute little babies that you can just envision them becoming, president of the United States or something. But then slowly they become a very needy child that requires a great deal of attention and are totally dependent on you. And then later they become sort of this sulky teenager that really doesn't care what you think about anything. But finally, if you do it well, they become mature adults, and if you do it really well, they age quite gracefully. And I think that's certainly the case for our Treaties exhibition. Now, we did have some considerable assets to throw at the project. Most importantly, we had a magnificent collection that provides context and gives some life to these things and helps put you in the place and time that these documents came into existence. We had the presence just across the mall of the National Archives where the actual documents continue to reside. We had a very skilled exhibition staff that had learned how to bring these things to life, even a complex subject like treaties. And then finally, we had Suzan as our guest curator. Now, Suzan produced all of the early treatments and draft scripts. And most of the key decisions, of course, are made at that stage. For example, which of the 380 treaties would we focus upon? And what stories could the collections actually support? We had some terrific things like wampum strings, wampum belts, pipes, peace medals, and many items specific to different tribes that really arose out of the treaty-making time and period. We also had to determine, or she had to determine, what stories we could really lend themselves to the opportunity to humanize historical figures. Did we have the images to support the exhibition? What anecdotes were there that really brought the stories to life? And Suzan did all of that hard work, producing truly voluminous research documents that I can confess now I never entirely read. But I familiarized myself with them, of course. Now, and then from there, how do we take these disparate stories and create a unified narrative? The word narrative is badly overused, and in the museum world, we like to use it, overuse it even more than in most places. But narrative is important. It really is, and a museum exhibition is ultimately storytelling. And to tell a story in a compelling way, you have to spend a lot of time thinking about it. One of the key moments in the development of the Treaties exhibition was after Suzan had produced this rather voluminous amount of material. A few of us sat down, and I remember this meeting well, and I suspect that Phil Deloria and David Penny remember it particularly well, where there are the four of us in our boardroom upstairs, having dug through hundreds of pages of material, several different treatments, several different approaches to it, had to try to figure out, what's it all about? What does this even mean? What are we trying to tell people? And through, we had a hard look at every story that Suzan proposed to tell. There were some discards. And indeed, I think Suzan would probably say there was blood on the floor because like all museum curators, they just hate to see any part of their perfect little baby have to be excised from the exhibition. And yet that's what always happens. Sometimes because it's just determined that the story doesn't quite do what we had hoped it would do. Or sometimes because the scholarship on a particular point remains uncertain and we can't say with confidence that this is how it happened. Sometimes a story is simply not well supported by our collections. We don't have things that can really bring it to life. And sometimes, and this is the worst, there just isn't enough room in the exhibition gallery for everything we'd like to do. Two of the stories I know Suzan really wanted to talk about, and they fall in the same category, were about unwritten treaties during the Civil War period. The United States was in no position really to be making war on all of the tribes at that time, and so they were in a peaceful mood toward most of the tribes, excluding the Dakota and Minnesota. And so they were having ongoing meetings with a lot of different tribes. And Suzan found this material showing that Comanches and Cheyennes, for example, came back to Washington, D.C., met with the president, got their picture taken with the First Lady, and but made essentially an unwritten agreement that they would remain neutral in the Civil War. Now, this was no small matter, given the small number of troops that were out there in that part of the country. And if the Comanches and Cheyennes simply said, okay, we won't take advantage of your weakness right now, that would be a major concession. Similarly, President Lincoln gave canes to each of the governors of the pueblos of New Mexico. And Suzan maintained that those canes really served as treaties in much the same way that a wampum belt would serve as a treaty in this part of the country and in the Northeast. And so, unfortunately, we simply had to cut something. And so those sorts of stories end up not in the exhibition as interesting as they are. So ultimately, a narrative did emerge that really was based around three themes. The first was serious diplomacy, that in the beginning of treaty making with any group of tribes or any region in the country, it was high diplomacy, and it was required by the interest of the United States that a treaty be made with a tribe or a group of tribes. For example, the Haudenosaunee in the Treaty of Canandaigua, the Muscogee Creek Nation in the Treaty of New York, and finally the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. In each case, the United States had important needs that could only be addressed by making peace in friendship with the tribes. The second section we called Bad Acts, Bad Paper, because the tribes referred to these forced treaties as bad paper. And it was in these situations where the tribes found themselves not in a negotiated relationship, but really having the terms of the treaties dictated to them by the United States. Needless to say, the tribes did not fare well in those situations. And we use as examples some stories that most people really don't know much about. One was the Potawatomi Trail of Death, the removal of Potawatomi people from the Great Lakes region through the Great Plains and ultimately down to Oklahoma. Another was the unratified treaties in California. The tribes there made treaties in good faith with commissioners from the United States, but through the machinations of the state of California and its allies in the Senate of the United States, those treaties never received a vote. The tribes didn't realize that having given their word and having received the word of these representatives of the United States, that they did not have a valid agreement under American law. And so they essentially became sitting ducks for organized, state-sponsored violence against them that reduced their numbers by something like 90%. Then finally, the third section of the exhibition was titled simply, Great Nations Keep Their Word. Now, there was a reason we needed to use that, even though it's a bit of a mouthful, and that was that Suzan's initial vision, the title that she wanted to use for the exhibition as a whole, was Great Nations in Their Own Words. Now, Rick and I, having spent too many years of our life studying the law, and Indian law in particular, knew what that was a reference to. There's a famous sentence from the pen of Justice Black in a decision regarding the Seneca Nation, where the United States was very openly and blatantly breaking its treaty with the Haudenosaunee, ironically, the Treaty of Canandaigua. And Justice Black, in dissent, because the Supreme Court upheld the breaking of the treaty. Justice Black wrote that great nations, like great men, should keep their word. And so we knew that, but as we went out and started testing the audience and asking them, so what if we named it Great Nations in Their Own Words, the audiences were going, well, we have no idea what that's about. So we thought, well, we better make this really simple, but not abandon the idea that this is about relationships between nations. And so we ended up with this very long title for the exhibition. We knew it was too long. We knew we used the word nation too many times, but we were going to leave the visitor with no misunderstanding about what this exhibition was about. So in the section, we revived a portion of the title in the last section, Great Nations Keep Their Word. And in there were basically three themes that we wanted to address. First, that the tribes never gave up. That notwithstanding their treatment at the hands of the United States, notwithstanding that the United States had violated a portion at least of every treaty they had ever made with any tribe in the United States, that the tribes continued to assert their treaty rights from the beginning and up to the present. And so we have these lovely photographs, historic photographs of delegations of tribes from all different parts of the country coming to Washington to lobby and to say, we made this agreement and we still want to see it carried out. We carried that forward into the era of more modern activism that's being covered by our discussion today. The second story we wanted to show was that of the Northwest Fishing Treaties, which were iconic in many respects for the tribes because it talked very specifically about the rights that the tribes had to fish free of interference from the states. And the tribes ultimately prevailed. And then finally, we wanted to show that because of all this tribal advocacy, things were getting better, and federal Indian policy was being revolutionized bit by bit, subject by subject, year by year. And this was a bit of an homage to Vine Deloria Jr., who referred to this legislation as treaty adjustments. And so we began to present them that way because they did involve the elements, many of the elements of treaty, which were negotiation, agency, and ultimately consent of both parties. So from there, the designers and developers took over and developed, for example, the Two Row Wampum Motif. Oh, wow, I wish I could time everything that well. So this is the Two Row Wampum Motif that was decided upon. Purple's an unusual color to use in an exhibition, but there it is, and it really worked. They devised some very interesting interactives, 4 separate videos, but most importantly was the case that holds actual treaties, the actual documents. Now we could only do one at a time, but the most important decision we made, because we're borrowing these, by the way, from the National Archives, to whom we're very grateful, and they've been very accommodating. But we made the decision to present these documents. If you ever go over to the National Archives, you might see the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And it's a very reverent setting. The light is low. They're protected by probably bulletproof glass, and in a very solid case. And so we wanted to do the same with these treaties and say these are just as foundational as are these other documents that we revere. And I think that's proven to be very effective. We've had about a dozen. We will have had about a dozen treaties in there, and each time we invite the tribes that were the signatories to these treaties to come and be here and see it before it goes under glass, and that's been a very rewarding experience for the museum. So I think it's fair to say the Treaties exhibition was a success. We received strong reviews from the usual suspects. We received an award from the American Alliance of Museums for excellence in exhibitions. But most importantly, we heard from the tribes, and the tribes liked it. And so we felt like we had succeeded. And this is another interesting thing about the Treaties exhibition. It continues to evolve. So even after the exhibition was in place and we had the opening and the reception and all that stuff, I read all the reviews and we're pretty darn pleased with ourselves, if I do say so. We got the opportunity to add a stronger ending than we had devised. And what that was during the Standing Rock protests, the tribes had, or the protesters, had created one of those signposts. Now, those of you as old as I remember MASH, and you remember they all had these directional pointers to their various homes and what the mileage was to get home. Well, they had done that at the Standing Rock camp. And it came to us in the strangest way because my wife, Anne Marie, had befriended a young Onondaga man named Hickory Edwards, who had paddled his canoe from upstate New York all the way down the Hudson and eventually showed up here in Washington on the day that we were opening, or on the weekend we were opening the Treaties exhibition. And so Hickory, being Hickory, was at the Standing Rock protest. And he had been the one who planted the tree stump that became the milepost marker. And so he wrote to Anne Marie, their Facebook friends, and said, we're taking down the camp. Do you suppose that the National Museum of the American Indian would want this milepost marker? And Anne Marie asked me if that were true. And containing my enthusiasm, I said, why, yes. So, again, Hickory being Hickory, we do a lot of stuff in order to acquire something. We got paperwork, and, we had a curatorial council has to do this, and the director has to sign that, and have to arrange for shipping, and it's all very expensive and lots of paper. But again, Hickory being Hickory, he showed up at the collection center a week later with this thing in the back of a pickup. So, and you can't believe the kind of trouble that causes all around, because it's just not done that way, But we were very grateful to get it. And so if you go into the Treaties exhibition now, that last part of the exhibition is quite different than it was before. And I think it's a very powerful ending, because the point of the exhibition is that these treaties established were not simply transactions. They established relationships between the American Indian nations and the United States. And that relationship is ongoing. And it's one that we all have a part in and that we all have responsibility for. These treaties will continue to be invoked and to be litigated as we continue to sort out these various challenges in the relationship between the United States and the American Indian nations. And I hope, I believe, and that what we did achieve with the Treaties exhibition squared with the vision that Suzan Harjo had for it from the beginning. So, thank you for your attention.